I am so glad you convinced me that the family car should be the Defender 110. It is so beautiful inside, it's so comfortable, and it just feels indestructible.
Yes, it really is. I've been waiting a long time for the new model to come out. The Defender 110, I'm telling you, it's my favorite car of all times. It's my third one. You know, I have stories of going off road. The guy managed the group. He was like, "What are you doing in this beautiful car?" I'm like, "I'm going off road." He's like, "Are you sure? Because you can use one of ours." And then they look like Mad Max cars. I'm like, no, we're going to do this. And he was shocked.
Wow. Well, it's great because the Defender has been reimagined for 21st century adventure, and its unparalleled off-road ability as well as its robust interior are invaluable whether you're headed towards uncharted territory or just a weekend of exploration. The Defender 110 tackles challenging surroundings with absolute confidence. The SUV conveys strength outside and in, featuring peerless technology like an intuitive driver display and an award-winning infotainment system. That's my favorite part, to keep you connected no matter where the journey takes you. Adventure is unique to everyone, and so is the Defender. Choose from the two-door Defender 90, the four-door Defender 110, or the larger Defender 130 with the ability to seat up to 8 passengers. You'll find uncompromising performance in all three. So pack up and go even further with the Defender 110. Learn more at LandRoverUSA.com/Defender.
These days, we're all investors, trying to be smart with our money despite our worst impulses. But at iShares, we believe that deep down inside of every investor is a better investor. One that's just waiting to be let out. Explore iShares ETFs and insights and let your best investor out. Visit iShares.com for more information.
This isn't your average business podcast, and he's not your average host. This is the James Altucher Show. Today on the James Altucher Show.
So the past few months, I've sort of been half doing an experiment. Sometimes people have wondered what I've been up to because I haven't posted as much on social media. I haven't written as much. I haven't emailed as much. And I was felt overwhelmed by social media. And this is not just in the past few months, but for the past 11 years. But particularly during this pandemic, early on in the pandemic, I felt for the first time in 10 years, it was important to read the news because I felt that the news was so wrong most of the time. I wanted to almost translate it so that people would understand what the headlines were saying, why the headlines were wrong, or why some of these articles were wrong or biased. And I'm talking particularly the ones about the coronavirus or the economy or whatever. So I started reading the news a lot more. I started getting on social media a lot more. I was doing podcasts every day, which I might get back to. But I feel like I got a little burnt out then for the first time in a long time on social media. So I completely stopped social media. And that sort of almost by accident led to me stopping email. Not 100% stopping email because you have to respond to some people, but I very rarely responded to a single email. You know, I'd go a week at a time sometimes without responding to emails. So I apologize if you were on the other end of that, but it was an experiment and I've been getting back in touch with people. But I'm so glad I talked today with Cal Newport, who wrote a new book called A World Without Email, Reimagining Work in an Age of Communication Overload. And I found that I was much more relaxed and the things that were bothering me, a lot of things stopped bothering me. And so Cal, of course, is all the data. I just have anecdotes, but we have a great conversation about this. Tune in, and perhaps on another podcast, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the burnout I experienced that kind of led to me taking a break. And it's important to take care of yourself if you want to be successful, and a world without email might be the key to that. But let's hear from Cal. You could automatically write programs.
Which theorem prover were you using? Were you using, what are these things called? Something VN?
Well, I
don't remember. There's these formal specification languages, right?
Yeah. So this was a long time ago. So I don't know if these things even exist now. But there are two languages for this: the Calculus of Constructions and Nupril out of Cornell.
Okay.
these were all derivatives of like the lambda calculus. So, which is
Yeah.
the real one-to-one relationship.
Sure. Church. Alfonso Church.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, we should do a whole episode just talking about, formal specifications of proof. We could talk about the decidability of theorems. We could do great. We'll do a whole theory podcast. We'll get your listenership down to 0, and my work here will be done.
What? Actually, we could start recording because this is fun.
Yeah. Sure.
What did you study undergrad? Computer science.
Dartmouth. Then when I went to grad school, I was in the theory group at MIT. So I was doing more of the useless type of computer science that we were just talking about. Actually, my PhD thesis, I didn't do this really smart. Typically, people take work they'd already published, and they're like, okay, let me put this into my PhD thesis, but I was bored with it. So I was like, well, let me just do something from scratch just for my PhD thesis. So I sort of did it from scratch. It had to do with distributed algorithms for different models of wireless networks. I gave this sort of formal specification framework for comparing and building on various channel models. It was a pretty insider baseball stuff, but basically I was a distributed algorithms guy. I studied under the woman who wrote the textbook on distributed algorithms.
You would think that would have like some practical use, like you could start a company or whatever.
Well, so there was distributed systems, which was where, like, how do I actually build Facebook? And that was really valuable. What I did was, it was more like navel gazing. It was, let's abstract away this distributed problem into a mathematical statement and then spend a year proving that this thing was impossible. An impossibility result that quickly goes away once you add in any assumptions about the real world. So I was a real specialist in proving things impossible, or there was no solution that could ever beat a certain bound. I really love those type of results because they're intellectually stimulating, but it really would put you down these alleyways that got farther and farther from the main thoroughfare of practical computer science. So
what got you into, the stuff that we've covered the last time you were on the podcast, which was many years ago now, and now this one where, we're going to talk about your new book, A World Without Email, and the last time you were on, we talked about your book, Deep Work. And also I've been following your stuff on ultra learning, the stuff that you're doing with Scott Young, who's been on the podcast a couple of times. And that's an area that I personally am interested in. In fact, I just wrote a book myself on some of the concepts of ultra learning. But what got you down this road of basically shitting all over email and social media and stuff like that?
Yeah. Yeah, and I had a feud with Mark Zuckerberg or something like that, right? It goes back. It's an interesting question. I had written, so the first 4 books I wrote had nothing to do with technology. So I started writing books as a college student. I was writing like student advice books. I was blogging about student advice. At some point, as I was transitioning from grad school into academia, I wrote a book about career advice, So Good They Can't Ignore You. It was saying like, follow your passion is bad advice. None of that had anything to do with technology. And it was after I was a professor. So I was a professor at Georgetown, and I was thinking what I wanted to write. And that book, So Good They Can't Ignore You, it had this idea that, getting good at things is like a fundamental currency with which you construct or acquire really good traits in your job, that like skill was foundational to actually building passion for your work. And so there's this follow-up question, how do you get good at things? And it was there that I was looking around at all my training at the theory group at MIT, and it was clear to me like, if you're doing intellectual things, there's a real value to focus without distraction. And, that's what led to Deep Work, which was saying like, hey, we should be careful not to undervalue focus. But then you have to ask the question of, why are we having such a hard time focusing? Why would we make it harder to focus at exactly the same time that it was becoming more valuable? And all of those answers led back to technology. And so it really wasn't until Deep Work came out that I found myself, my thinking and what I was writing about was just completely intertwined with trends in technology in our personal life and work, which was fortuitous because as a computer scientist, it actually makes sense for me to be writing about the impact of tech and culture. And so once I started working on Deep Work is when I started to also start thinking deeply about tech and its influences and its side effects.
It's interesting because, if you look at, I always sort of feel, there's a lot of literature on flow. So you probably read the book, I'm sure you read the book Flow by Macaulay.
Chicks at Me High.
Yeah. And so a lot of the stuff on flow, like for instance by Stephen Kotler and other people, focus on the physical sorts of flow. So if you're mountain climbing and you get into this flow state, it increases your performance, which is really important if you're risking your life. But there's this intellectual flow, like that you engage in when you're, let's say, doing art or writing or computer programming. You get into this flow state that's more in the mind. And then, yes, I think there's many results. Any interruption at all just throws you off by at least, it takes you out of flow for at least like a half hour, some arbitrary number like that. I forget the exact numbers. This is related to what you're saying, that in order to really do deep work, you can't have any, the kind of intellectual work that gets into a flow state where you have, supposedly 6x the performance and productivity. You can't afford any interruption. And yet we're always being interrupted by either email or social media. And in fact, these things are often referred to as addictions. And I agree with that. So
yeah,
I'm just stating my own story, and then I want to get into your book, A World Without Email, and that'll overlap a little bit with deep work as well. The past 3 or 4 months, I've basically been on a social media and email fast. Like there's some days, even during like weekdays, where I'll go the entire day with no without looking at email, without doing any social media, and sometimes I've basically gone 3.5 months now with almost no social media, and it's hurt me a little bit, and it's helped me a lot. Like it's hurt me in the sense that I'm no longer distributing, work across my normal media for distributing like writing and so on. But at the same time, I'm not sucked into these, nonstop meaningless discussions and emotions and so on that occur on social media. Like you get involved in a conversation on social media and you think it's real, but it's actually not. And you only realize that when you stop conversing on social media, that it has nothing to do with your conversations and relationships in real life.
Yeah. Well, I think this is one of the single most important insights from neuroscience that is relevant to the world of work that is absolutely ignored, which is context switching's killer. We really underestimate the degree to which if you take your attention from one target and you move it to another target that's unrelated or particularly distracting, such as an email inbox, which is a cognitive nightmare because you are exposing yourself to communication from other human beings that requires a response and you don't have time to respond to them all right now. It's a cognitive nightmare. You try to come back to whatever you're doing, there is a massive cost. Like that context switch creates a huge pile up neuronal speaking. I don't even know that's a word, but in your neurons, and your ability to actually think plummets. And it's a really big deal. Context switching is a killer cost. So if you set up your work such that, okay, you have to constantly tend, let's say, communication channels, or self-impose, you're constantly tending social media because you're trying to see if like the democracy is crumbling today, or if you're about to die from a virus, or whatever could be going on. Either way, it's basically the cognitive equivalent of saying like, I'm going to keep a bottle of whiskey here while I work and take a shot every 45 minutes, right? You're having a similar effect on your ability to think. I just don't think people realize that. I think we learned in the early 2000s to not purely multitask. Everyone thinks they're really great because they don't keep 3 windows open at the same time. But we didn't realize that all of the cost is still coming from I jump over to my inbox every 15 minutes. And when I say 15 minutes, I'm being generous. Actually, once every 6 minutes is more the average for the American knowledge worker. It significantly reduces our ability to think. And as you probably experienced in its absence over the last month, it makes us miserable. Our brain, it gets anxious and run down and unhappy when you keep switching it back and forth between these different contexts. So like if there's any idea from science that the world of work has been ignoring, but could get a 10x improvement if they acknowledged, it would be that. Design how your work happens in such a way that you minimize the need for context shifting. Right now, we do the opposite.
Right. And one way to explore this is to look at what are the benefits of both social media and email. So one question you can ask is, has anyone really advanced their career because of what they did on social media? And the answer in some cases is yes. Like for instance, that woman, Sarah Cooper, who was doing those imitations of Donald Trump, and now she has a Netflix special, and she was posting it all on TikTok or Instagram or whatever. So that was good for her. So some people who become like Instagram influencers or YouTube influencers and they get paid to do that, there's certainly a benefit to their career. But for the average person, let's try to think of what are the benefits that in your research that you've seen from both social media and email before we get into the disadvantages.
Yeah, well, they're very different, even though they feel similar, right? So when it comes to email, like one of the big ideas in the book is the role email plays in many knowledge work organizations today is that we have built up these workflows. I call it the hyperactive hive mind. But
Yeah.
basically, we've decided the way we are going to organize our work, like the way we're going to identify and assign tasks and review tasks or whatever else, is we're just going to have this ad hoc, unstructured, low friction communication, like through email or through Slack. It's all the same as far as I'm concerned, right? If that is the fundamental way that work is organized and coordination happens in your organization, you have to be on email all the time. Which is why, when you just simply say, oh, you should use email less, or we should have an email-free Friday, or, just batch your email, just only check it once a day or something like that. When you're trying to solve the problem at that level, you're never going to succeed so long as the underlying fundamental workflow in which your organization runs is back and forth communication. So one thing I argue all the time is email is almost certainly very important to what you do in your job right now. When we get to the disadvantages and how we fix it, just a little TLDR, we're going to have to go under the covers and replace how we actually organize work. If you don't replace it and just stop using the tool, you're in trouble. Social media, I'm much less generous to. I think you're right. There are people who legitimately their job is to be an influencer on social media. That's an incredibly narrow band of the population. Then there's a slightly larger band of entrepreneurs who, if they use social media properly, gets an epsilon boost to their marketing and awareness. But again, this epsilon is on top of their marginal.
Mm-hmm.
So you have think of it like multiplying a small term against the overall value you're creating by how valuable is the stuff you're creating, how good are you at what you do. That determines the rough, gross, oversized shape of your value and market. If you're really good at social media, then maybe you can boost it a little bit. But you can't quadruple it or something like this. So I think there's this whole group of people for which there's a real tension. They're getting some benefits, they're getting some costs, they're about in balance. And then for most other people, it's really just you're a cog in the social machinery factories, right? Like it's a distraction. They push your buttons. It has a statistical profile view. It knows what to show you. It helps you avoid having to confront your own thoughts or problems in your own life or boredom, but it's a net negative. So it's a very small number of people make a great living on it. A larger group of people have a sort of roughly balanced cost and benefits. They run a business, they get benefits, they get cost. And then for most other people, it's probably strictly on the negative side of the ledger.
Right. But you used an important word earlier, which is replace. And let's take the case of someone who is not overwhelmed by email at work, but is still feeling an addictive quality to email. And you talk about this in the book. Some people check their email every minute even. And I think the average was, I forget what you said, every 6 minutes or every 3 minutes, and some absurd number. And it's the same thing with social media. I'm gonna keep lumping these in together for a while because there's some people who communicate primarily through messaging on social media, and particularly younger people don't use email as much as, let's say, a slightly older generation does. They message on all the different platforms. But I don't think you can reduce the addictive quality of this by stopping cold. I think you have to replace. And then there's the further issue with what if you have to use email for work on a very regular basis all day long. So the first issue is we're just using email and social media too much, but it's hard to just stop cold. It's like this dopamine addiction, and you can't really just stop. It doesn't really work.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's make this division to clarify the conversation. So when we're talking about social media, let's separate out professional communication over social media, like, oh, this is how I'm getting in touch with people or organizing or collaborating with people, versus consumption. Like, I want diversion and distraction. So the diversion and distraction piece of social media, I'm on TikTok all afternoon, that's like in the social dilemma documentary territory. That's where you have services that are being engineered to be addictive. When you're using social media from a consumption, entertainment, diversion, distraction perspective, that's where you have to be worried about all those social dilemma issues of, I'm using this way more than I should because it's engineered to do that. And now let's lump in, and I think this will be helpful, let's lump in using social media to communicate professionally with email like you're doing. And so now what we can focus in on is, let's call them just like digital professional communication tools. And here I think you're absolutely right, and this is the core of the book, is that replacement is the key, and it's what we haven't been talking about. So we don't realize the degree to which we implicitly acceded to this idea that the best way to organize work in a digital age is with a constant ad hoc, unstructured back and forth conversation. These tools made it possible in a way that used to be impossible once you had an organization beyond a few number of people. But there's huge cost to doing that. And that if we're going to solve the problem, you have to say, how are we going to work instead? And I think it's the failure to ask and answer that second question is why we have largely failed to sidestep any of the major negatives of this sort of constant business communication that we all face.
And you talk about these platforms in your book, but to some extent, the development of very structured communication tools like Slack, where the communication's organized around projects and work groups and so on, I think was an attempt to structure email communications a little bit better. But your point is it doesn't really work that well.
Right. So I wrote this article for The New Yorker a couple months ago. Once Slack was acquired by Salesforce, or Salesforce said they intended to acquire Slack, I wrote a piece for The New Yorker basically reflecting on Slack. And my thesis of that book is that Slack is the right tool for the wrong way to work. So my claim in that article, and it's echoed in the book, is that basically when email came along, we stumbled backwards into this way of working, what I call the hyperactive hive mind, where everyone just send ad hoc, unstructured messages. We'll just figure things out on the fly with messages. Your inbox is where everything comes in. Email wasn't really meant, the tool was not really meant to keep up with so much communication from so much different people. So Slack was a way to come in and say, well, what's the best tool for the hyperactive hive mind workflow? In other words, if the way we're going to work is just constant back and forth, ad hoc, unstructured messaging, what's the best tool for that? And so my conclusion is we have this love-hate relationship with Slack because, if your organization runs with a hyperactive hive mind, Slack is a slicker tool for doing that. So that makes us happy. But that general way of working where we just constantly communicate is terrible for our brains, and that makes us miserable. And that's how we end up with this weird relationship.
But won't that reduce the email communications with outside people? Like, oh, my mom is emailing me in the middle of the day. Since that's not work related, it won't appear on Slack. So Slack does seem to solve kind of the random emails that also, permeate the day.
Well, that problem is more easily solved by just, you have your Gmail address and your work address. But what it did solve is a few things. It's much better for group communication. CC was a clunky way to have a large group of people interacting with each other. It also solved, and this was a big one, the piling inbox issue. Like I get into this, the psychological distress that is caused by knowing that there's an inbox that is filling in the background, and that every 10 minutes you're away from that inbox, there's more messages piling up. Slack helps reduce that because it's synchronous. So if you're not there on the channel, you can't really have messages pile up. People have to wait until you're there. So that was a really key problem it solved. And also it was searchable. So all of that was good. The bad is that it increased the velocity of communication. So the amount of times you communicate, the amount of times you're servicing communication got even higher. So that the core problem of the context switching, the catastrophic context switching, that got amplified in Slack. So that's why we have this love-hate relationship. It made some things about email being used to implement the hive mind. It made some of the big issues there better, but then it took the core issue of that way of working, which is the context shifting, and made that even worse. And so people don't know how to feel about it. So they spend billions of dollars for the company and at the same time curse its existence.
Yeah. So let's talk solutions. Like what can I do? What can I do? And again, this book's called A World Without Email. So we're specifically talking about email, but I'm also concerned about social media and where that can go, or will it go, if we're going to solve this problem.
Right. Well, that's right. I mean, the title's World Without Email, but what I really mean is a world without that hyperactive hive mind workflow, where all work just takes place with ad hoc, unstructured messaging. So my pitch is that world was birthed because of the arrival of email. There are now other tools that help service that world. So we can throw these all into the same category. My core argument is you can't tackle this with norms and habits and hacks and tips as long as the underlying workflow says the way things happen, the way we collaborate, the way we coordinate is we just message back and forth. As long as that is the only way you have to organize your organization, you are going to have to use whatever tool it is, email or Slack or social media DMs or whatever you're using. You are going to have to use it all the time, and it's going to make you much less effective. And so what I'm all about is replace the hyperactive hive mind with better, more specific, bespoke, optimized processes and workflows for the specific things you do as a knowledge worker. Be very clear. Here is a particular thing I do that creates value. Here's how information comes in. Here's how information goes out. Here's how we coordinate ourselves to get this done. Once you have specific processes, you can optimize them. And once you start optimizing them, the number of this sort of context switching and communication that's required can be drastically reduced. And when that happens, the value you produce is going to drastically increase. So I'm all about fixing the underlying workflows so that email is no longer something you always have to be checking.
So let's take an example. Like, let's say someone's a marketing manager at Procter & Gamble, or let's say someone does accounts receivable at a doctor's office. Okay, they get emails all day long. Like, I don't even know what emails the average person at these jobs gets, but like, describe a scenario and then how you would solve it.
Well, if you're in like an accounts receivable scenario, this is a very structured workflow. It's easier to just have people send you emails, but this is actually a pretty easy case because you could very easily have some sort of process that's deployed in that office where whatever it is, like you move the contracts into this Dropbox file. There's 2 times a week, and I don't know this well, I'm just kind of making this up, but there's 2 times a week where you go into this, you take all the pending contracts out of the Dropbox file, you process them through your system. The finished contracts go into this file. There's a call on Wednesday morning for a half hour, or you have a shared document where any questions you have are put in. You could systematize that job such that there's basically no ad hoc email involved in these whatever they are contracts coming in and getting signed and registered and filed away. More complex, let's say you're a marketing manager, so you have like a team that you're managing, for example.
You have a team, you have vendors, you have contracts, and so on.
Well, each of these things, first of all, you want to handle differently. It's like one of the case studies I give in the book is like a UX design firm, and they completely changed their client communication process. They said, okay, here's what we're going to do. Once a week, we have this call. It's pre-scheduled where we check in. Here's how things are going. What questions do you have? Crucially, right after that call, we will write down everything we committed to doing during that call, and we will send you a copy of that so you have it in writing. It turned out that was all the client needed. Like if they have clear expectations about what's going on, they don't feel like they need for lots of sort of ad hoc communication. If you're managing a team, a big idea that comes up in the book a lot is tasks should be much more transparent. There should be a board inspired by what software developers do, for example, where you can see here's what the team is working on, here is who is working on what, here is the status of these things. And now we can like much more effectively stare at this virtual board. We can do it synchronously, just like software developers do. We all log in on Zoom or whatever for 20 minutes. Who's working on what? What do you need? Okay, let's check back in again at the end of the day. So just by making who's working on what transparent, now you can have a lot more structure. So I mean, these are just examples, but it's all about what are the different things we do and how do we actually want to do these things. It doesn't necessarily require lots of messages. And my example is the thing you should try to minimize when optimizing your knowledge work organization is context shifts required to actually finish a task. How many times do I have to, for example, receive and send another email to accomplish this goal? And you want to design processes that minimize that. Just like if you were building a car assembly line, you're trying to minimize, how many man hours it takes to get from raw parts to a built car. We should be thinking about minimizing context shifts. Once you start thinking that way, there are hugely innovative examples over how you can start running your organization.
So how does the problem start? Because take a company of computer programmers, for instance. It's not like every task takes 3 minutes and then you have to like look at your email for the next task. Like you say, you get a task at the beginning of a week and it probably will take a week or more to finish that task. There doesn't need to have nonstop communicating. In terms of transparency, if other people want to see what you're doing, they can there's plenty of tools so you can see what's the status of this project and how's the programmer doing. And if the programmer's okay at their job, you won't really need to follow up with, with an email that says, hey, what's going on? You should do this, this, this. Like, so how does the problem actually begin?
So when you say the problem in this instance, we're talking about,
A big increase in what you're calling context shifts,
yeah,
but just essentially interruptions from email.
like you're asking, how do we get there, basically?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so one of the things I argue is by accident. That one of the interesting things, if you go back, and I did this, like let's untangle the story of the rise of email. So, I spent a lot of time in like the New York Times business section archive in the 70s and 80s, like just watching the technology get mentioned more and more. I talked with researchers who in the early 90s and late 80s were the very first people to think, how can we use computer networks to make work more efficient, right? So I really tried to study, how did we get to where we are today? It's largely accidental. Now, in the philosophy of technology, this is called technological determinism, but basically the argument is that the very presence of the tool, so the very presence of very low friction digital communication, changed the way we worked in a way that was emergent. No one decided it was a good idea. No one sat down and said this would make us more effective. There was no Harvard Business Review article that was like, if we could just communicate 100 times a day instead of 20, we'd be more energetic. It just sort of happened once we actually had this tool around. I give an example. There was a study, really cool, where this was a Gloria Mark from UC Irvine. They went to a company and said, we're going to take like a dozen people in this company, and for 1 week, we're going to take them off email. Like no preparation, just to see what goes wrong. They wanted to study the role of email by seeing what goes wrong when you take it away. And the researcher was telling me more recently that there was this particular subject in this study who had been bothered by his boss. It really annoyed him, but he had to set up this lab a few times a week. They did experiments in this company, and his boss would email him with all these urgent things while he was setting up the lab. And during the week where this guy was allowed to not use email, he was forcefully taken off email. The boss stopped bothering him while he was setting up the lab. But what made the story really interesting is that the boss's office was 2 doors down from the lab. So all the boss would have to do to bother him would be to walk 7 feet down a hallway and open the door and be like, hey, Bob, can you do whatever? That little bit of friction got rid of all of those small tasks, all those things that was making this guy's life really miserable, which just underscores that when you take the friction of something down to zero, really weird things can happen. You can get feedback loops and things can spiral out of control. So my contention is that the hyperactive hive mind, where everyone's just talking to everyone all the time, it's largely accidental. It's like no one thought it was a good idea. No one studied it. It just emerged haphazardly in a distributed fashion once these tools were available, which is why I think it's completely reasonable to step back and say, well, do we like this? Is it working? I think we are way too quick to just say, I guess this is what work means now. Let's invent Slack. I guess that's what we're doing. We're just going to communicate all the time. We're too quick to accept that. And if we step back and put some perspective, we see, I think it just emerged. And there's a lot of dynamics for why it emerged that I get into in the book, but that's the summary, is it emerged on its own as a way of working. It did not have our best interest in mind. It's not the best way to organize knowledge work. We have to move past it.
But now a lot of people are working remote because of, this pandemic has accelerated this cultural trend of remote work or self-motivated work or lifestyle entrepreneurs, where you have somebody who's involved in a bunch of different activities to have different income streams. And how can they manage their process better? Because they're using email for, let's say, work on 5 or 6 different unrelated tasks with different teams. Plus they have their social emails. So what kind of habits should these people develop?
Well, so over the summer, I wrote this big piece for the New Yorker on remote work because, obviously everyone was thrown into remote work because of the pandemic. And so I went into the history of remote work and what to expect in the future and how it was working now. And one of the big arguments I had in that piece is that the more structured and thoughtful your underlying processes and workflows, the more effectively you're going to be able to work remotely. It's why, like, the one industry that has had very little trouble going remote, and in fact, we're already largely remote before the pandemic, was software development. Why is that? Because software developers, for other reasons, have these incredibly structured approaches to how they work. They use these agile project management methodologies where there's task boards and you're using Scrum or using Kanban or whatever it is, right? They were already very structured about how their work happens. They had no problem going remote. There's huge software companies that are already have been remote. And so that was one of the big conclusions I have, is that if you're working remote if you don't have those ad hoc productivity heuristics you get in an office where I can grab you or talk to you in the hallway, or we can just see each other's face in the meeting hall, when you get rid of all of that, the more structure you have, the better. So I think a silver lining, I mean, this was the conclusion of that article, is that a silver lining of this forced movement to temporary remoteness is that I'm hoping that it's going to force a lot of organizations to actually get their act together about, we need better processes and workflows than simply, I have an email address, you have an email address, let's just rock and roll and figure it out. So the more structured you are, the better.
Oh my gosh, I love these clothes. Mizzen and Main. That's Mizzen and Main. It really is the most comfortable work clothes. Travel clothes. I had to travel this whole week. I'm traveling for a week and a half, and I just took Mizzen and Main clothes with me. Close out 2023 in style with comfortable, breathable, packable, and machine washable pieces from Mizzen and Main. As you wrap up your year-end goals, enjoy a Mizzen and Main dress shirt that you can wear confidently. I like that they've very, very just nice, solid colors. I don't really like to get all fancy in patterns and everything, although they do have some pattern shirts, but very comfortable clothes, stretchable pants. It's just super comfortable, but they look professional, and you can wear them casually or professionally. I like some of their flannel shirts or untuck shirts. I love untuck. I never tuck in. So again, whether you're shopping for a special someone or giving yourself the gift you really want, I just buy myself gifts. Mizzen and Main is the perfect gift for any guy who works, travels, and or cares about looking and feeling great. As you could tell by my many photos across the internet, I care about looking fantastic. I'm practically a model. And let's be honest, every guy loves to look great. So again, shop now at mizzenandmain.com and save 20% when you spend $130 or more using promo code James. That's promo code James at Mizzen and Main, Mizzen and Main.com. You know what I love about fantasy sports is that even though I'm not going to be a great basketball player or a baseball player or a football player or whatever, I feel like I get to participate and make decisions and use my knowledge of these different leagues or these different sports to compete. So it's like I can pick my team or I can pick my favorite players, and I could use my knowledge to make predictions and maybe even make money. So with the basketball season here, you can now pick combo projections across football and basketball from the Specials League on Prize Picks. This is a league created specifically for combo projections that include two or more players from different sports or leagues. Want to play alongside some of Prize Picks' favorite players like rapper Meek Mill and comedian Andrew Schultz, who's also been a guest on this podcast, and I've been a guest on his? You can now find community plays under the promos tab of the app to view entries for some of the biggest names in the Prize Picks community each week. Look, Prize Picks even offers a reboot policy so that your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. For football and basketball games, if you have a player who exits the game in the first half and does not return in the second, that player is rebooted. Prize Picks is the only daily fantasy sports platform with an injury insurance policy. What? So I love playing it. I love anywhere where I can use analytical ability with my interests to demonstrate some skill and maybe make some money. And I like the game-like aspect. I do wish they had chess as a category on prizepicks.com, but I'll settle for what they've got. Maybe I should make my own fantasy chess league. But in any case, I love Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/James. Use code James for a first deposit match up to $100. That's the easiest $100 you're ever going to make. So that's prizepicks.com/James and use code James. Daily fantasy sports made easy. The future of learning is definitely online. Like, it's such BS that you have to spend $200,000 or take $200,000 in loans and go to some fancy school when It's useless. It doesn't guarantee you a job. Most employers, including me, do not care about degrees or grades or anything like that. We want to care that you love what you're doing, that you know what you're doing, in some cases that you have experience or that you're willing to learn. But people in general love learning and are curious. Like the key to success is curiosity. And I think masterclass.com is the perfect model for online learning. I'm really happy they're sponsoring this episode. If you're going to give a gift, give the gift of learning. Masterclass makes a meaningful gift this season for you and anyone on your list because both of you can learn from the best to become your best, from leadership to effective communication to cooking. Let me tell you some of the classes I've taken. I've taken comedy from Steve Martin. I mean, can you believe I can take a class from Steve Martin on comedy, or Judd Apatow, my favorite comedy director? I could take an actual class from him on writing. Wolfgang Puck on cooking. Dan Brown on writing, or Judy Bloom, who's been on this podcast, on writing. By the way, Wolfgang Puck also has been on this podcast. It's such a pleasure. I try to take classes all the time from masterclass.com. And whether you're watching Masterclass on TV or listening in audio mode in the app or on their site, the quality speaks for itself. It's like these Masterclass instructors are your own personal mentors that are going to help you reach the next level. How much would it cost to take one-on-one classes on comedy from Steve Martin or on chess from Gary Kasparov? You just wouldn't be able to do it. But it would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. With a Masterclass annual membership, it's $10 a month. Memberships start at $120 a year for unlimited access to one-on-one classes with all 180 plus Masterclass instructors. So it's not just $120 for one instructor. You get all 180 plus Masterclass instructors. Boost your confidence and find practical takeaways you can apply to your life and at work. And if you own a business or are a team leader, use Masterclass to empower and create future-ready employees and leaders. That's the real education in today's world. So this holiday season, you can give one annual membership and get one free at masterclass.com/JAS. JAS, of course, stands for the James Altucher Show. So right now you can get 2 memberships for the price of one at masterclass.com/JAS. Masterclass.com/JAS. Offer terms apply. What about, though, the addictive quality of email? So, like, I work remote and I work on a bunch of different tasks. And often I'll be working on one task, but then something completely unrelated, from another project I'm working on will send me an email, or a friend will send me an email and I respond. I have to kind of, shift focus. I context shift, as you say. So there's like this addictive quality where, it's hard for me to structure, because the one thing about having multiple jobs or tasks is nobody down any one silo cares about your work in the other silos. And I don't say this in a mean way. It's just, it's not their business. So if I'm working on a book and I'm working on a podcast, the people, my editors of my book, or the people I work with on the book related projects, they don't want to hear about like, oh, well, I'll get back to you tomorrow. I'm working today on podcast stuff. It's not their, They don't care. And so they want their emails responded to.
Yeah. Well, change the processes, right? So like with my book publicity I'm doing now, because I wrote this book, I was like, okay, I should probably have a lot of processes for my publicity team, because this whole book is about processes that avoid back and forth, emails or this or that. And so, like for podcast interviews, there's a process I set up with the publicist I work for. We have this shared document. The details are less important, but the goal of it is we don't just send emails back and forth, right? I check this document once a day. I answer questions. I give times. I schedule things. I move things onto my calendar. It's very predictable. It creates one context shift. I spend longer when I'm in there, but it's one context shift per day. All of the work happening to schedule podcasts without that process would probably generate 7 to 12 context shifts back and forth throughout the day. So it's like a drastic improvement to the cognitive footprint, So the more you actually have processes for this type of work, here's how I want to do it. For this type of work, here's how I want to do it. You can minimize the context shifts. You also minimize the addictive nature of email. So if you have a single undifferentiated inbox into which everything comes, there's always a lottery ticket that could be scratched in there. And I agree, that's very hard to resist. The other side of that Janus coin is anxiety. So when you know you have a single undifferentiated inbox that's filling up with people waiting for you and you're not looking at your inbox, it makes you more anxious. So we get both addiction and anxiety
Right.
by having a single inbox through which things come in without any structure and expectations are just ad hoc and everyone just wants their answer quick. You get addiction, but it's also really a misery generation machine. I wrote a whole chapter about the psychological reasons why that model makes human beings in particular miserable. I mean, I think we all have this background hum of anxiety that is imposed by the way we work and is not fundamental. We could work in ways that would get rid of it. We're just used to it now. But that inbox always filling, does not play well with our social brains.
Yeah, like I'll take a look at my inbox right now. I mean, even just since we started, I have like about 100 emails, and most of them are just garbage. Like they're because it's really hard to get rid of email that's quasi spam because it's not quite spam. Maybe once in 100 emails, I'll want to take a look at this one thing, but it just fills up my inbox, and I have to spend part of my time just deleting useless emails. So I don't know what to do other than just not look at my email boxes, which is what I've been doing. But then that causes problems because people want to know why I'm not getting back to them. I'll get email. Yeah. A good chunk of my emails every day are, "Hey, are we good?"
Yeah,
not responding.
Well, yeah, but what else are you going to get if it's the hyperactive hive mind's ad hoc unstructured?
Yeah,
right. It's like why there's this paradox when you run a client facing business, and I ran one of these when I was a kid. I had a .com company during the first .com boom. So I was a high school kid in the 90s with a company, right? But we did like web development and web consulting and stuff like this. But this was the 1990s and I'm in high school, right? So that means I don't have a laptop. I don't have a cell phone. That wasn't really something that people had back then. And so I was literally unavailable from whatever it was, 7 a.m. until like 4:30 in the afternoon every day, right? Like there was no smartphones you could use to surreptitiously check email or something like this. So you would think this would be untenable. We had clients that had paid a lot of money. We had teams we were working with to do the development. Today, it would just be email back and forth all day long. We couldn't do it. So what did we do? Well, this was more popular back in the 90s, but we built out this client extranet. You could log into it with a password. There'd be a calendar. You could see what was happening each day, when the deadlines were. There was a work diary blog so that you could see, okay, here's what happened today. Things are going on. There was regularly scheduled check-in meetings. And we had this whole thing designed so that, you wouldn't need to reach us. And it worked perfectly, right? If clients had clear expectations and clear information, they were happy to not have to waste their time talking to you. It turns out the reason why clients bother people all the time is because they don't have a reasonable expectation that stuff is getting done. There's not enough structure. Like, look, are we on it? What's happening here? What about this? I'm going to send you a ton of messages if I don't actually trust you to get things done. But if you structure it in such a way, expectations are clear. There's clarity. It turns out clarity is much more important than accessibility. And you can push that to an extreme like me in the 90s. You couldn't email me, and yet we service tons of clients fine.
So it's almost like email and email overuse has become a substitute for trust. And that trust is no longer expected as much in communications because email has maybe inaccurately convinced us that it's a replacement for trust. So you don't have to have the burden of trust anymore because email supposedly band-aids that.
Well, yeah. And it's really natural, right? So it's very natural, very cheap, and very convenient. So like one of the big ideas is if there was just 3 of us, it was like me, you, and Jay, and we were in a field somewhere hunting, like the way we would communicate would just be ad hoc and unstructured. Like, of course it would be. I'd just be like, James, you go over there. Jay, you come over here. Hey, watch out for that mammoth over there. Like, we would just ad hoc, back and forth, unstructured. That's how we would coordinate. That's how humans have always coordinated because we've always been in very small groups that were synchronously present. It's the natural way that human beings coordinate. The problem with the way we work today is email has allowed us to scale up this very natural thing to thousands of people, and it doesn't scale. I mean, that's why this is a problem that email invented, is it was very natural for us to say, oh, great, now with all of these different people I work with, I can communicate the same way that I would naturally communicate if there was just two of us working on a project together in a garage, the way that humans have always communicated. And that's the easiest way to do it. It's convenient, it's flexible, it's also very cheap. You just buy one email server, you don't need bespoke applications. It's very easy, very convenient, very natural. So there's a reason why it's very popular. It just doesn't scale. When I have 20 clients and 30 people in my organization and 17 vendors, that's starting to get pretty crowded in this metaphorical savanna where we're hunting the mammoth. It's too many people to have this ad hoc back and forth. So that's part of the paradox. It works with small groups of people. It just doesn't work once you get more.
Let's take that example though, where you have like 30 clients and also you have a team of people and you have all these things. Do you kind of say, okay, this part of the day is we're not going to do emails? Do you structure it that way, or do you try to structure it that way?
You got to go deeper. See, that's the problem. If you stay just at the level of what is our interaction with our inbox, not how does email actually play a role in organizing our work, the problem's not going to be fixed. This is why email-free Friday has always failed. It's why batching emails is not a reasonable approach. It's why the Tim Ferriss autoresponder fell out of favor. It just didn't work to say, I'm just going to check email at the end of the day, because like, well, wait a second, Tim, like in our company, email is how we do everything. So if you're not on email till 5, actually nothing gets done. So in that example, I would say we have to get down to the basics of what are the different things we do? What are your responsibilities? What are your roles? What are your processes? We need alternatives. We need to specify, here's how we deal with client check-ins. Here's how we deal with accounts receivable. Here's how we deal with putting together marketing memoranda. Whatever the things are, we need processes that specify how the information comes in, how we coordinate, how we execute. Because it's in the absence of that we fall back on email. I think that's the number one problem in fixing this problem. When I talk to C-suite types, like for example, they always use the word norms. They're so convinced that we're just like a few norm tweaks away from a productivity nirvana. If only we could just have a better norm about expectations for response time, we'd be all set. And I always say, no, the problem is your whole company depends on very fast response times. You don't have an alternative way for this work to get done. You have to have an alternative way for this work to get done, or we will inexorably be drawn back to constant communication and pay all those prices.
And so let's bring social media into this for a second. And I know that your book is focused more on the workplace and email, but your work in general has covered all of these topics. A lot of people they realize they're addicted to social media and that is harming their work. But similar to what you're saying about email, I don't think it's good enough to just say, okay, I am cutting social media cold, or I'm only looking at Twitter for a half hour in the morning. I don't think addictions work that way, because you need this, you're desperate for this dopamine hit, and you're going to get it one way or the other. You can't just sort of like use willpower to get rid of an addiction, which is why there's entire organizations and rehab facilities and so on set up for other addictions, but not so much for social media. So what's a solution there? Like what's kind of steps people could take? And again, the idea is not necessarily to avoid social media, but to understand that you're going to be a lot more productive and happier if you can deal with this issue.
Yeah. Well, social media is both easier and harder. This issue is both easier and harder than the email problem. It's easier in the sense that it's very hard to just unilaterally completely solve the email problem if you work for a big company, because the issue is the underlying workflows in your company. And until you change those, it's hard to improve your relationship. Now, there's a lot of things you can do as an individual if you create your own processes to make it better, but fundamentally, it's an organizational problem. I hate that I keep referencing New Yorker articles. It's just that I've pulled a lot of ideas from this book into the New Yorker over this past year. So I had this article recently called The Rise and Fall of Getting Things Done. I'm pointing these out just so it's like an easier way to get at these ideas than having to leaf through the book. And like the core idea there was we can't fix these issues in the workplace as individuals. Like the organizations have to overhaul things. Okay, so social media is easier because you can fix the problem yourself. Your relationship with social media is your own relationship. You have full autonomy there. It's harder, however, because you also have billions of dollars that have been invested to try to perpetuate an addictive relationship. Like Microsoft isn't trying to get you addicted to Microsoft Outlook. The fact that you have to use Outlook all the time is because of your company's work practices, right? They don't care. They don't make more money. They sell this many seats. It's not by minutes used. But social media, a ton of money has been invested to get you to keep looking at it. So it's easier because you have autonomy. It's harder because it's more engineered to be addictive. The solution to this is actually a book I wrote in between the last time we talked and now, it came out in 2019, was called Digital Minimalism. And it focused really on technology in your personal life and social media in particular. And one of the big ideas from that book was if you come at social media use reduction from a negative reduction standpoint, like I'm using this too much, I don't like that, I want to use it less, it's not very sustainable. What seemed to work more, and I'm basing this off an experiment I ran with 1,600 volunteers where we went through this process, is to have a positive enhancing perspective. And so what I had people do, just to make this more concrete, is take 30 days. And during these 30 days, take a break from all of these sort of personal, like non-necessary for your work tools like social media and streaming video, et cetera. During those 30 days, I had them very aggressively, through reflection and experimentation, really get in touch with their values. Like, what's really important to me? What do I want to spend my time doing? What do I want to do with my life, especially outside of work? Like, what type of person do I want to be? And then at the end of the 30 days, they rebuilt their digital habits from scratch. But this time they did it just to amplify the things that they identified as being important. So like, look, I'm an artist, and so I need Instagram to get creative inspiration from other artists, so I will use Instagram, but now because I know why I'm using it to get creative inspiration, I can very easily put rules that make sense. Like I don't need it on my phone, I'll do it on my computer, I'll do it twice a week. It's like a TV show I watch.
But was it sustainable, or did it fall apart the second they got a bad comment on something and then suddenly they got down the rabbit hole?
Well, it was much more sustainable. So what I found is if you have a positive vision, if I want my life to be this, and your habits for your tools support a positive vision, that's much more sustainable than if your approach is, I don't like this bad thing. I think Twitter is bad. I spend too much time on it. I want to spend less time on Twitter. That degrades much more rapidly because you're like, yeah, in general, I want to spend less time, but I am bored right now, or I want to know what's going on with whatever. And you're right back in it. Because, fighting back against a negative reduction is very weak. But if you're trying to instead fight for a positive image, it was much stronger. Now, that being said, the people who did this exercise would have to revisit it 2 or 3 times a year. Right? You're constantly having to revisit it. Whoa, what's happened here? Why am I on Twitter all the time? No. What is my vision of what I want my life to be about? What tools support that vision? What are my rules for using these tools to support that vision? Good. Let's go. And like when I went through that exercise, I have no social media accounts. Now, that's a little bit out on the extreme, but it's not that extreme of a response if you take this positive approach. When I did this exercise in my own life, there weren't things I valued that I would look to particular social media tools and be like, that's a big boost to it. And so it's been very sustainable for me because I'm focused on this positive thing. I want to keep this positive vision of my life going, as opposed to I use this too much, I want to reduce it. And it has not been that hard to avoid it. So that's the one lesson I learned is work backwards from what you want your life to be like and how tools fit into that. That's much more sustainable than identify what you don't like about tools and try to reduce it.
So I'm going to try to convince you to use social media, and let's see what happens. So you create content. You have these New Yorker articles. You have these books. Your books go on bestseller lists. You have an audience of people who want to hear what your opinion is. Twitter is a great way, for instance, and Instagram as well, but let's just focus on Twitter for a second. Twitter is a great way to spread these messages and get people reading your message who maybe haven't even heard of you before, because of somebody who has heard of you and who likes one particular message you're spreading on Twitter will retweet it, and others will retweet it, and people who don't know you will say, oh, who's this guy, Cal Newport? I like what he's saying. I'm going to follow him. And then they start seeing your other messages and so on. So this could be a very productive tool for you from a marketing perspective and also even from a communication perspective. So on Twitter, there might be other people engaged in similar process of discovery about what you're interested in, and you could find them and exchange notes with them and build a community with them.
Right. But I mean, I could also argue that another known strategy that helps build audiences is to speak all the time, right? That's certainly an old author trick.
But when you speak to 100 people, and when you tweet, you're tweeting to 200,000 people.
Right, but you have a more intense engagement with them, and then they all buy the book, and that spreads. So that's an old strategy. Or if like you're in the political sphere, become a regular on cable news. Now you have a brand. Like these are older kind of pre-social media strategies. All of them have benefits, right? They also all have costs. I don't do any of those either. So the way I come at it is not that is there some potential benefit. It's is there a benefit there that I think is like the best way to use technology to amplify something I care about. I do want my ideas to spread. I think they do a pretty good job of spreading. I don't see there being a big enough advantage if I'm the one on Twitter tweeting that's going to make a huge difference. I don't know that I would have a much bigger audience. Maybe I would, but maybe I'd be producing a lot less. And I know for sure I'd be a lot less happy because I think Twitter, especially in recent years, has become a misery creation machine. And so when I do this calculus, it's like, look, here's things I care about. I think I'm doing them at a high level. I think it's impactful. I think I enjoy it. And I have a lot of autonomy over my time. I mean, when I did this calculus with book writing, like one of the things I found is that it's actually less important that the book author is themselves talking about themselves than it is that people are using whatever the tools are to talk about the person, right? Like that's one of the misunderstandings in social media is like you saying out pithy things on Twitter is probably much less impactful than people spreading things written about you or positive things about you on Twitter among themselves, right? That it amplifies people talking about you is more important than you amplifying your voice talking about yourself. But more importantly, I don't trust myself on those tools. I think the misery and the distraction would far outweigh whatever benefit it would have in terms of, I mean, I guess it would percolate down the book sales. Like I'm not quite sure even how to quantify the metric. So like I'm happy with that.
Like I think when a book comes out, like for instance, some of my books I publish traditionally, some I self-publish. And particularly when I self-publish, I'm the only one who releases the information that my book has now been published. And so Twitter and social media become useful for that. Like I am able to inform my readers, hey, I just had a book come out. And I can kind of prep them weeks in advance. Hey, on this date, my book's coming out, and so on. So that it provides that useful role for me,
sure,
which I don't know how I would replace except for going on podcasts, for instance. Yeah.
Well, yeah, but like your podcast probably has a similar impact, if not larger, but a much less sort of distracting toll. I mean, look, and I don't mean to argue that people shouldn't use these tools, the content creators shouldn't use them. I'm going through like, even the idea that it's possible that someone like me comes up with the answer that I'm not going to use it, I think that's surprising enough for people that it's worth getting into how that's even possible. But like when it comes to Twitter, I'm kind of throwing out numbers, but let me know if you think this is about accurate. I think the impact of 200,000 Twitter followers in terms of your book sales is 3,000 books.
Tops.
An extra 3,000 books every week.
I would say it's probably even less because some of those 3,000 would have bought the book anyway. And I think the number is less than 3,000. Let's say it's 2,000, but I'm making this up. I don't really know. But let's say it's 2,000 because 3,000 sounds high. I would say half of those or more would have bought the book anyway. Those are the people who have read you enough that they would have known without Twitter that, it's only 1% of your followers. 1% of your followers is going to know what's going on in your life without being informed via Twitter about it. So, of those 2,000, 50% or more probably would have gotten the book anyway. So then maybe the actual impact is more like 1,000 or less. So I agree with you. And I just know the one benefit. So again, for the past 3.5 months, it's not like I've eliminated Twitter completely, but I've stopped using it for the first time in 10 years. And the impact on me was that the biggest impact was that I stopped interacting with people who were negative about me or the message I was trying to impart or whatever. Because any interactions with someone who is negative, that's just completely time and mental energy just flushed down some social media toilet. Like there is absolutely no value. And yet somehow the brain thinks those are real interactions and conversations that you need to have. Like someone in the tribe is saying negative things about me, I need to respond. And that's when you're addicted to these things, you feel like you have to respond because you feel that person's right in front of you, trashing you, and then everyone is seeing it. So you have to respond to it.
Yeah. Well, we have a mutual friend, I think, the comedian Jamie Kilstein, who I grew up with. We played in a band together. Yeah, I've known him forever. But I remember him talking about what it was like, Twitter, especially when he was going through a period where he was being attacked a lot. And he said it physically felt identical leaving his apartment to imminent physical attack was coming. Like that was the state his body was in.
Yeah.
Is like, I don't know if they're going to come from here or there, but pretty soon the club is going to hit you in the back of the head. Our mind doesn't know about the size of audiences. It doesn't know about anonymity. It doesn't know about the fact that there's, a billion users on Twitter. It just can't sort that out. So yeah, I think that's a huge cost. The misery, the anxiety, the upsetness that occurs, especially once you are semi-well-known and interacting with people on Twitter, I think we vastly underestimate the impact of that on our productivity and emotional well-being. I mean, if I told you, like, look, I have this tool. It's like a TV that has like a really good show on it. It's really entertaining. Here's the catch. Like a few times a day, someone's going to jump through your window and kick you in the groin. And you're not, but otherwise it's like a really fun, the shows on it are really fun. It's like, Friends or something. You'd be like, I don't care. Like, I'm not going to watch Friends if I'm going to get kicked in the groin, 3 or 4 times a day. But that's kind of what Twitter offers. Like, I meet interesting people. I can kind of spread the word, but 3 or 4 times a day, I'm going to get, that dagger,
Yeah.
I was like, do better, period. And you're like, and is that trade-off? I don't think we're balanced. Well, not you and I. You're doing a great job. I'm doing a great job. But I think a lot of people are not balancing that trade-off.
Well,
properly.
the only reason I had to do this is that it was getting so negative. I could definitely feel the misery that I just stopped going on it. And it wasn't like a conscious decision even. I wasn't getting any reward for going on it. So I stopped using it. And my life has been significantly better as a result. I don't know if I'll ever go back to using social media the same way. I wanted to cover just real briefly also, so Scott Young has been on the podcast to talk about his book, Ultra Learning. And earlier on, I remember I had him on when he finished his MIT computer science degree in 10 months, a 4-year degree, finished in 10 months just by doing the online courses. And now you guys together have a course on Ultra Learning. And this is something I've been really fascinated by for decades. And I just wrote a book about it called Skip the Line. And I've switched careers and interests a lot. And the problem with switching a career and switching interests is that you have to get good enough quickly so that you could monetize it, or else you just won't have the time really to focus on your interest. But so it requires some aspect of ultra learning. And I dived heavily into, learning the nuances of the 10,000 hour rule. I talked to dozens of people on the podcast and so on. Tell me a little about your course.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm excited for Skip the Line. I mean, as you can tell from like the course and my friendship with Scott, I love these topics. We did a course called Life of Focus, which we open it up a few times a year. So it'll probably be opening up again soon. But there was 3 parts to it. So we had focused mind, we had focused life, and we had focused work. And they're all kind of based on our book. So you have like a focused work month, which is all about redesigning the way you work to have more uninterrupted time, more deep work. There's the focused life, which is like this digital minimalism stuff I was just telling you about. How do you rebuild from scratch your relationship to your tools like social media and streaming video, etc., video games, so that it's supporting a good life and not distracting you. And then focused mind is built directly on ultra learning. It's like, okay, how do you learn really hard things fast? And then like over a period of a month, you actually go through, you choose a project, and we sort of walk you through it, and you get used to how you do this, how you figure out what to work on, how to practice, how to get the feedback, how to get a good return on your energy investment. You got to focus deliberately on the things that really matter. More generally though, and I'm sure this is in your book, I think this is something that people, one of the side effects of a culture of constant distraction is that to learn something complicated requires intense focus. It's the way it actually works at the neurological level is you have to actually be through intense concentration, pushing yourself past where you're comfortable. So actually getting these new neural circuits to fire in the right way. It takes a lot of concentration to do the right thing. You're trying to push your understanding on, the statistical package or whatever it is. Through that stretch, you harden those circuits and it gets easier. Without the stretch, you can't learn things. And if you're not comfortable with like a cognitive stretch, like just like an athlete is very, very comfortable with being very winded or having their muscles be very sore from a workout routine. If you're not comfortable with this hurts, it's hard, but I'm concentrating anyways, it's very difficult to learn things fast. And nothing makes you softer when it comes to that than having taught your brain that every time you're a little bit bored, you get a shiny treat, algorithmically optimized distraction.
Yeah.
I always look at my phone when I'm a little bit bored. I think that's the cognitive equivalent of being an athlete that smokes. Like when it comes time to now I need to concentrate really hard. I don't really understand integrals. I got to understand it. And I'm going to have to concentrate to stretch past where I'm comfortable. If you look at your phone or email or something, every time you're a little bit bored, it's like the smoker's lungs trying to run the mile. It's just like your mind can't do it.
You know,
And so I think that's a place where the rubber hits the road.
yeah, I agree with you. I mean, in the book, I focus on ways to basically not quite skip the 10,000 hour rule, but to shortcut is also the wrong word, but basically alternatives to the 10,000 hour rule to learn something extremely quickly. And
Yeah.
definitely avoiding social media helps. You know, I read somewhere, and it might have even been something you wrote, that even if you have a cell phone on a table at dinner, let's say you go out to dinner with friends, if you have a smartphone on the table and it's face down, so you're not going to look at it, but it's just there, it's distracting to everybody on the table. Like they won't be able to focus on you as much.
Yeah. That just the presence of it does that does reduce everything, basically, your cognitive capacities, the distractibility. We're playing really fast and loose with our brains right now at exactly the time that our brains are how we make a living. You know, I just think in like ancient Sparta, where your athletic battle prowess was everything, you probably were very careful about what you ate and how you trained, because like your whole society and economy depended on you being able to go and beat the Athenians in a war. Well, right now, our superpowers, our brains, our ability to think, our ability to learn new systems and learn new ideas and be creative and produce things. And we completely take for granted that instrument. And I guess because it's not that visible, like you can't see your brain grow a gut or something like you can when it comes to your
Right.
physical activities. But I got to tell you, people who take this stuff seriously, take this stuff seriously. If you look at, for example, hedge fund managers, you know, who regardless of what you think about them today, that is a group of people which have been interesting to me because they can quantify dollar and cents, the cost of being distracted and their brain not being sharp. And you see a lot of innovation among them, right? That's where there's a whole subculture of hedge fund managers that use this particular flip phone, Dodoro, because the distraction of a smartphone could be difference in $10 million net this month, right? That's where, you know, the I'm forgetting his name, but the Searching for Bobby Fischer,
Josh Waitzkin.
I'm forgetting Josh Waitzkin, right? Like part of his consulting practice was actually like basically working with big finance people and helping them really learn how to focus their brain and not be distracted and think really sharply, the way he had to win chess games, because it really made a big difference. So I saw that in the theory group at MIT. Your ability to stare at a whiteboard for 3 hours was a tier 1 skill. It was like how fast you could run a 440 if you were a football player or something like that. So there's these pockets of really high intellectual achieving pieces of society where people really care a lot about what's going in my brain, how am I taking care of my brain, how well can I think, how can I sharpen that. I just generally think that that circle should be way wider than hedge fund managers and, you know, theoretical computer scientists, that for huge swaths of our economy, people would be much more productive and happy and effective, you know, if they took their cognitive health as seriously as they did their physical health.
What would be an interesting experiment here? Like one interesting experiment might be for every email you get to sort of put a time on it, a time limit on it, where you could say, okay, maybe I have to respond to this within 5 seconds in order for this email to have the correct impact on my life. But with most emails, it's probably, okay, I have to respond to this within 24 hours or 48 hours or a week in order for it to have the exact same impact as if I responded in 5 seconds. And I bet you in most cases, it's not 5 seconds. It's most cases, it's like about 4 or 5 days that you need to respond to some interruption. And then that could kind of help you determine, like, okay, well, during the day, I obviously don't need to have my phone on me or check emails, because I already know 99% of my emails don't need to be responded to within, 4 days. Even like, well, people say, oh, I need to take my phone out because I have kids. What if one of my kids gets hit by a car? I always say, by the time they got hit by the car, there's nothing you could do. Like, even if you get the email, it's not like you're going to prevent them from getting hit by the car. You could go to the hospital and sit in the waiting room, and that's important, and, express support, but they might be knocked out anyway or in surgery or whatever. even something that's so critical as that, you don't really need to respond or see that email immediately.
Right, right. Well, it's a bad expected value calculation. Like you and I grew up in a period where, if our parents were away and we're home with a babysitter, they didn't have phones. There'd be no way to reach them. Or if we were at school, there was no way to reach them if they were away from the office. And nothing bad ever happened. So your expected value there is going to be really low. You have this whole cost of having the phone with you all the time for a very minuscule chance. Here's a second exercise I would suggest. For a period of time, every email that comes into your inbox, write down, identify what is the general process that this email is related to, right? Is it, if it's like spam mail or something like that, well, this is related to my, I receive information from the world through newsletters processes, right? Is it from a client trying to check in on something? This is through my client's maintenance process. Actually say, well, what's the process this thing is associated with? And just watch this list grow. And then you're confronted with, I guess these are all the different processes in my life for which right now email communication is playing a role. And then you can go through this list and be like, okay, which of these are important to me and which aren't? So right away, you can, once you actually write it down as a name, you're like, I don't really need to have that as a process that I spend time on and try to optimize. I just don't need to do that type of thing. So you get rid of a lot of those things. And then with what's left, you could think, is there a better way to do that than to just send messages back and forth, to just rock and roll? And there's something about just assigning things to processes that you come away after doing this for one workday with a much clearer view of oh, here are the 7 things I mainly do. And here's 8 other things that I am doing that I shouldn't be. And it's so much easier than to be okay, so let me just unsubscribe from these and just stop doing this work and stop saying yes to coffees, because none of that stuff's that's not the right way to do it. And these up here, let me optimize, right?
That's a good exercise, because even let's say newsletters with information. All right, you subscribe to that newsletter for a reason. You want to get information about X, Y, or Z. But I even realized over the past couple months that, okay, by not reading this email, I'm not going to get this information. And that was fine too, because there's only so much information. I thought I was very interested in this information, but if it's going to crowd away other information that's more useful or interesting to me right now, this moment, I don't really need it. I can keep it in my inbox somewhere, but I don't really need to look at it until I need to look at it.
Yeah. Or if you have a name for it, okay, the process that this newsletter is a part of is I like to be up to speed on what interesting people are up to. Once you recognize that's the process, you can ask the question of, well, what's the best way to do it? You might realize oh, maybe the best way to do this for me is not to subscribe to 20 random email newsletters. Maybe I need to subscribe to one magazine that comes weekly, and I read it Saturday morning at my favorite coffee shop, and I have a little ritual around it. And it's still scratching that itch of I'm reading Harper's instead of 17 email newsletters or whatever. Or, okay, I like what these people have to say, but what I do is I have an iPad and I go to this restaurant I like, and I have their 6 sites bookmarked. And it's a 1-hour ritual with coffee, and I'm not subscribed to mail list. Once you have a name, this is the process and this is the goal, you can ask, what's the best way? If I want this process in my life, what's the best way to actually implement it? And 9 times out of 10, you realize the way you're currently servicing that important process in your life is very ad hoc and not very efficient. So it's once you have a name for it, you realize there's a ton of other ways to solve the same problem, ways that have much smaller footprints on your life.
Yeah, this is also interesting. And again, I've been directly experiencing this almost by coincidence the past few months. So I'm glad you wrote this book, A World Without Email. And it goes along really nicely, if people haven't read it, with your book, Deep Work, Digital Minimalism, So Good They Can't Ignore You. And I'm really curious about your course on focus and ultra learning. We should talk again about that at some point. But Cal Newport, author of A World Without Email, Reimagining Work in an Age of Communication Overload, New York Times bestselling author of Digital Minimalism and Deep Work. Thanks once again for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, James. I enjoyed it.
Me too.
At FedEx Office, we know that for small businesses, the holidays can be stressful. But we're here with the holiday cheer and expertise you need to help get your to-do list done. Need to create that? Our online design tool has got you covered. Pack and ship these? Just come in store and we'll take it from there. Print those? How does same-day turnaround sound? This season, let us help you slay the holidays with the products, services, tools, and timelines that will make your business bright. Create more happy for the holidays at office.fedex.com.